and we are live.
Thank you. A very good evening to all. I'm pleased to announce the commencement of the second lecture series of the Center for Studies, Gender, Culture and Media, abbreviated as CSGCM. The current series is titled Many Facets of Sustainability. The decision to expand and enlarge the concept of sustainable development in the domain of cultural studies through a series of lectures gleaned from different disciplines, which would explore the multi-layered understanding of the concept, emerged with my interest in subsequent studies on the garden as a unique site of heritage conservation and sustainable development. The popularity of the term sustainability has grown rapidly from the mid-1980s and had crossed the domains of environmental studies and economics. It shows how often sustainability term appears even in literature. The notion, which had its root in environmental sustainability, has quickly expanded social and economic sustainability, known as the three-pillar concept of three dimensions of sustainability. The cultural dimension, which has to do with the maintaining of cultural beliefs, cultural practices, heritage conservation, culture as its own entity, attempts to answer the question of whether or not any given culture will exist in the context of the future, now be deemed as the fourth pillar of sustainability. Cultural sustainability can be regarded as a fundamental issue, even precondition to be met on the path towards sustainable development because of its power over the people, as decisions that are made within the context of society are heavily weighed by the beliefs of that society. Today we have two speakers with us, Dr. Debashree, who is an associate professor of comparative literature at the Jadavpur University, and Professor Amita Sinha, who is a former professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We will start with Debashree's paper, a brief introduction to Debashree, who will be speaking on Indigenous Knowledge and Sustainability, story from the Okanagan. Debashree Dattaray is Associate Professor in Comparative Literature and Deputy Coordinator, Center for Canadian Studies at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. She has been the recipient of a Fulbright Alumni Award 2019, Shastri Mobility Program at McGill University, CICOPS Fellowship at University of Pavia, Italy, a Fulbright Nehru Visiting Lecturer Fellowship at UC Berkeley, the Erasmus Mundus Europe Asia Fellowship at the University of Amsterdam, the Fulbright Doctorate Fellowship at State University of New York, Stony Brook. Her areas of research and publication are postcolonial studies, environmental studies, indigenous studies, education, gender, narrative, comparative Indian literature methodology, and folklore. She is also is the author of Oral Traditions of the Northeast, a case study of Karbi Oral Traditions 2015, and has co-edited The Crossroads of Literature and Culture in 2016. Following Ford had passed discussions on the narrative in 2017, eco-criticism and environment, rethinking literature and culture in 2017, and has been the issue editor for a special volume on Indigenous Studies for LitCrit, Indian as a response to literature, December 2017. With this, we invite Debashree to deliver her. The rest of the speakers are requested to mute their audio so that no incidental noise comes and disturbs the speaker. Debashree, would you please begin?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I hope everyone is safe during these difficult circumstances. It's a pleasure to meet you here, everyone else. You can see Professor Jadavpur, Dr. Chaudhary, Professor Mukhopadhyay, and of course, the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media, and also Professor Amita Sinha and their students. So, probably one of the first things that I need to do today before I begin is to give a sense of place.
Excuse me, ma'am, your video is not visible actually.
Okay. Right. So, one of the first things that we need to do is really before I go on to what I'm going to talk about. This video will give us a sense of the Okanagan and why the Okanagan at this point is so important for all of us. Um, so, I hope is this visible? The screen? Is the screen visible?
Yes, it is visible. It is visible.
All right. So this is one of the Thank you. So, this was one of the things that I wanted to begin with so that we have a sense of the place that we are talking about. And before I will have, as is the norm, a PowerPoint, but I'll come to that a little later. One of the first things that I wanted to tell about this particular issue is that Jeannette Armstrong has been someone who has been extensively associated with the idea of the Okanagan, and for her, language, community, and land are the leitmotif in the philosophy and her writings. She's someone who's also worked extensively in the Enopen Center, something that I will talk about. But what I needed us to have is a sense of this Okanagan Valley, which is across the British Columbia, first area that we're talking about with slopes in the north, desert and antelope brush in the south. So this particular southern valley, which is home to a diverse variety of unique flora and fauna, is a project that is a lifelong project for someone like Jeannette Armstrong. In fact, one of the things that happened, and this is very recently, and I'll come to that in a while, Before that, we need also to understand that where does Jeannette Armstrong come from? Uh, Jeannette Armstrong comes from a sense of place, and this sense of place is something that she speaks about in this opening paragraph on a chapter that she's called Land Speaking, and she'll tell us that it is my conviction that Okanagan, my original language, the language of my people, constitutes the most significant influence on my writing. It is what she calls as her experience of the land, which sources and arises in her poetry, prose, and in the Okanagan language, which shapes the connection. This lifelong engagement has even has metamorphosed in different ways. The first, of course, was the Okanagan school curriculum, which began in the mid 80s, or actually the latter part of the early 80s. And this was a project that was phenomenal in its impact in the Okanagan Valley. Because for the first time, there was this indigenous scholar who came up into the field and said that you need to speak in my language. And you cannot have a school curriculum without minding the Okanagan with certain values which spoke about the relationship with land. Um, in very recent times, in fact, this is in November 2020, this was something that came up as a podcast with David Suzuki Foundation, and this was very important, where you see it speaks about the coronavirus which exists in water and which is carried in tiny droplets. So one of the themes that came up with David Suzuki in my third episode was COVID-19 and the basic elements of life. And when he, of course, speaks along with young members such as Autumn Peltier and Ali Rougeau, he also speaks with Jeannette Armstrong of the Penticton Indian Band and about the importance of language in framing worldviews. So, and one of the things that comes up over here is the great gift to all life is the hydrologic cycling, in which water evaporates, condenses in clouds, and falls as rain. So life is a part of that cycle. So what comes up across this is that plants, fungi, bacteria filter water which is sucked up from the ground. Now, how is that even relevant to what we're talking about? This is relevant because uh, it's also Armstrong has been someone who has been involved with the Okanagan water supply projects. And as we talk about it, we know that a lot of North America has been engaged in this very difficult debate with respect to fishing rights in coastal Salish areas. Uh, so what Armstrong tells us is that she talks about traditional water keepers around the world, which show us our responsibility to protect, honor, and share it. So, how can we learn from them about water's role in all life on Earth and our responsibility to use, protect, and share it? So, for Janet Armstrong and her people, thinking about sustainability means thinking about the land as a whole. An organism cannot survive outside of its ecosystem. So that water is what she says in this podcast. It travels through air, travels through the land, travels through our bodies. If you could see that flow of water that continuously ties everything together as a life form in those cycles of rain, and snow and rivers and wetlands in spring, those are all part of what brings life to us. So it's our life. So Janet says that the water cycle shows us how everything is connected. Our ecosystems are in constant conversations with each other, and when one part of the system isn't doing well, the entire system is hindered. So these recent lifelong debates also brings up certain issues that plague a lot of North American universities. In fact, it's also something that happens close to home. methodology. How does one understand Indigenous methodology? And really one of the beginnings to understanding Indigenous methodology is for us to have a sense of place, a sense of place, a sense of space with respect to indigeneity. Before I will go on to the PowerPoint and explain a little more, I would like to show another video, a shorter one. This is a short clipping of Armstrong herself speaking, and this is of course where she talks about the knowledge of place and how that is indeed going to her understanding of the world at large. I understand that the screen is visible. Yes?
Yes, it is visible.
Oh,
Yes.
Thank you.
How, for instance, the view from our mind, from the Okanagan mind, that the view of land has more to do with the idea of how things interact at different levels in nature around us, and how knowledge and learning has to do with understanding what those interactions are and how they, in a loop, return back to us in terms of how they impact us, and understanding those as systems. And I know Fritjof is going to talk a lot more about that, so I'm not, and very in a much more knowledgeable way than I can talk about it. But it's very clear to me that learning in relation to that process, and learning from the natural world requires understanding systems and understanding how systems work and how systems loop back to yourself, even though you might seem to be removed from nature and you might seem to be removed from community. In other words, you might seem to be an individual, but you really are not. And you really are much more integrally and interconnected with those things, and that the wisest learning process is to understand what those connections are and where we have to maintain and sustain our integrity in terms of transferring that learning to our students. And I think in a lot of ways, when we, as speaking for Okanagan Indigenous people, in terms of the way we think about land, we never have ever thought of it, I don't think, as anything static, as anything physical. We've always thought about it as a process of interactions, a process of change, and a process that's ongoing. As you know, you can talk about the land and all the things that populate the land, but you actually have to understand that for us, that in any of the four seasons, you have a whole different set of critters that populate the land, or that are alive or awake, or that are doing different things at different times. So it never is static. It always has a whole different set of things going on as a part of life. So understanding those systems and understanding and being part of that does something in terms of how and displays and gives knowledge in terms of how systems work, and how systems work really well, because nature's been working really well for a long time. And so one of the things that we think about as Okanagan people is how those systems should inform us in terms of our interactions and the principles that we need to think about and adhere to. So in the process of learning, in our society, one of the things that we have come to understand is that there always needs to be that connection from the individual, and the connection to the family, and the connection to community, and the connection and how that intersects with the natural world. That there needs to be a clear understanding of how that system works, and that there needs to be a clear understanding of how we as individuals are a part of that. And so the learning process is a multi-layered learning process that is modeled by experience, that is embedded in the language, that is embedded in the ceremonial process. So a ceremony isn't just about me and my connection to believe in as the creator. But ceremonial process is about the understanding that if I act in an ethical way and acknowledge something in on the land as a being an essential part of me and being an essential part of that mystery of creation, that ceremony is a process of learning and embedding that ethic and that idea.
Thank you. One of the things that is important and which comes out through this whole process of understanding Armstrong's work and Armstrong's concept with respect to Okanagan is a concept called timix, and it's something that I'll come back to in a while. But before that, one of the reasons that she's important and crucial is, of course, her understanding of all my relations. When I speak about all my relations, with respect to Indigenous communities, is the fact that it means that each and every part of the world, whether inanimate or animate, is part of who one is and where one comes from, and that works in different ways, and articulates different voices, which has, of course, been part of Armstrong's responsibility. The other aspect, of course, going back to the section, is according to Armstrong, the Okanagan Valley therefore deserves respect and care from its people for the services rendered over the years. It involves sensitivity towards the ecosystem and towards a particular way of life, which involves the intermingling of lishking the land language, first language, earth mother language. So as an indigenous community, in order to ensure sustenance for future generations, it becomes imperative to contribute towards the building up of the community. And this is something that Armstrong has worked as an artist. And as an artist, she feels that there's a sacred responsibility to return the gift of cultural expressions in such a manner that the larger community is also benefited. So, in Whispering in Shadows, which was of course published in 2000, she uses this intricate narrative style that takes us through the life of a young Okanagan woman, Penny Jackson, and through her childhood memories and through the memories of her grandmothers. So set in the 80s and 90s, the text often reveals the timeless interconnection between politics, economics, ecology, and how such connections have adversely affected the life of Indigenous people, especially in the wake of globalization. And this is something that she has also put up recently in certain TEDx talks that she's delivered and other places that she has been. So the text is of course reflective of Armstrong's concern as an environmentalist about the devastating effects of the world's depletion of natural resources. In fact, the protagonist's death from cancer as a result of unhygienic working conditions epitomizes the decay of the environment. As an Okanagan writer and activist, Armstrong's goal has been to educate and empower her community using history and culture, and this is something that she feels very strongly about, because she believes that the responsibility of the artist is to ensure, however much the art is elevated, the community alongside must be elevated as well and must benefit as well. And I think these are important interventions that are being, this is an old story for anybody who's acquainted with Armstrong. The reason why we're still talking about it in 2021 is because we are increasingly being concerned about collaborations, and collaboration, as we realize, is a dirty word to use when we talk about Indigenous communities. But we're looking at ways of ethical collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and probably one of the best ways of looking at it is through working to goals of sustainability. Armstrong herself, of course, has been deeply influenced by the women in her family. One of the most important people is, of course, the fact is Ishunga or Morning Dove, who's supposed to be the grand niece and who's supposed to be who's believed to be the first Native American woman novelist. In fact, Morning Dove's Kojiwa, the half-blood, which was US in 1927, almost 10 years after the completion of the manuscript. Um, and it also that of course opens up a different avenue about the publication and issues with respect to publication for Native Americans and Native Canadians as well. Since 1978, actually, Armstrong has been working at what's known as the Enlighten Center, which is a cultural and educational center for the Okanagan people. And the word Enlighten in Okanagan is also the name, which is also the name of the original writing center, of which Armstrong functioned as an executive director for the longest time, is a conceptual metaphor. Because according to the Enlighten website, it involves coming to a consensus through a collaborative group process. In fact, Armstrong writes that the Enlighten Center is committed to the fulfillment of a mandate to provide educational programs which will encourage and support the perpetuation of Indigenous knowledge in our everyday lives. So a dialectical relationship is shared by all of creation, animate and inanimate, and this is an integral aspect of Indigenous philosophy and offers us the key to understanding Indigenous cultures and traditions. Such a philosophy is of course significant given the fact that most Indigenous authors usually have written for the longest time for an Indigenous readership, epistemologically and ontologically located within an Indigenous worldview, sharing responsibility, therefore, for creation and relations therein. So, when I'm talking about responsibility, I'm talking about the also what's known as responsibility. The ability to respond to relationships that exist, relationships that are not always articulated as we would like them to be. In an interview that Armstrong gave to Hartwig Eisenhagen, she tells us that social constructs which promote a certain way of dialogue and a certain specific way of perceiving the interaction with not only people but the rest of creation becomes paramount in terms of a fundamental difference and a fundamental difference in literature. We are aware of the fact that fictional narrative often offers a space where philosophies are seen in action, where their consequences, their burdens, and their fruits form what we know as the story. The reason for literature, therefore, I would believe, is always story. Discourse becomes an ongoing process, a changing process of social practice shaped by dialogue, responses, feelings, and interactions. Another person that I would like to mention here is, of course, Paula Gunn Allen, who's written now here at Learning, who writes in this essay, very well known as the Sacred to Contemporary Perspective, that for the American Indian, the ability of all creatures to share in the process of ongoing creation makes all things sacred. This implies that each and every part of life is responsible for the enhancement of experiences and understanding. It also perhaps relates to the choice that many Indigenous authors have had to make vis-a-vis people as individuals and the idea of community. Communities emerge from extended family ties, kinship, which in turn, of course, postulates the idea of the Indigenous family. Thomas King, who's Cherokee himself, writes that he believes that the idea of community and its relationships with individuals is often ignored by non-Indigenous writers because the latter would prefer to imagine Indians as isolated figures on the verge of extinction. Of course, Indigenous writers, on the other hand, would like to assert themselves in relation to a thriving and alive community, which, of course, would relate to the larger environment. The contents of Armstrong's many essays, in fact, reflect her concerns as an Okanagan writer today. Essays which talk about discipline and sharing education in the Indian way, traditional Indigenous education, bridging cultures, cultural robbery, words, racism, C's for culture speaking for generations, and other topics, other subjects that go on. Each of these essays, in fact, reflects Armstrong's concerns to critically shape the voice of social practice. The voice of social, when I speak about voice of social practice, I'm also talking about indigeneity as a social practice through dialogue and thus leading towards understanding difference. Uh, According to Armstrong, unless Indigenous people learn to, and this is what she writes, is re-hardwire themselves through literature, they would not be able to understand and tackle the effects of colonialism. The emphasis on shared words implies the importance of storytelling as a mode of social, cultural, and historical exchange of experiences. And therefore, one of her major concerns has also been the preservation of the environment for the community she loves and derives her inspiration from. So she insists, I claimed, unclaimed and owned by this land, this Okanagan. Voices that move within as my experience of existence do not awaken as words. Instead, they move within as the colors, patterns, and movements of a beautiful kind of Okanagan landscape. So, for example, her essays such as Land Speaking, Sharing One's Skin, Okanagan Community, Unclean Tide, an essay on sound and relations, Let Us Begin with Courage, are all essays which deal with the tremors faced by a changing ecosystem. Armstrong identifies, and this is very important, women power in the preservation of the environment. She feels that as people cease to care for the natural world, respect for women and responsibilities they undertake diminishes since the landscape is synonymous to grandmother voices that narrate wisdom and truth. Consequently, the writings of Armstrong's essays reflect a continuous engagement with the changing ecosystem and a desire to disseminate indigenous systems of thought. Um, I would like to know, yeah, okay. I just wanted to have a quick question. Chandravati, how much more time do I have? Can you let me know?
About 15 minutes more.
Oh,
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, perfect. Okay. So it gives me time to go to what I was moving towards is the PowerPoint. And I hope this is visible to everyone.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. So first, going back to what this is. Right. So these are certain thematic areas that has knowledge, indigenous knowledge system, and I think probably two things that are very important to do here, especially when we are living within a pandemic situation, is elders and local knowledge. Until very recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had read these very devastating news of elders passing on in community, and with that, an entire culture, an entire language that simply disappears. And of course, with it, ethics, values, education, everything else. And so this is probably one of the most difficult periods for indigenous communities. Also, of course, a pandemic is not new to the indigenous community, and it has also led to the development of different forms of resilience with respect to this. So, how does one look at what indigenous communities believe, or how does one look at it? So, one of the ways of looking at it, and this is with respect to how one might venture in the indigenous knowledge systems, in the academia is of course to place indigenous perspectives at the center of inquiry, which is if you look at these blue circle kind of things where you have this nice little chart, you have one of the first things that I would like to draw your attention to is of course emphasis on place, and which is why I wanted to show that video by where Armstrong speaks about the sense of place. And I think the sense of place and the language that the place tries to express is not always tangible, and it is grounded in certain indigenous ways of knowing the world. And probably that is something that must be taken cognizance of. Because as we would definitely, a lot of us over here in this gathering would know that such ways of knowing have been dismissed or negated for the longest of times. Because, and that's the process of decolonization that must begin. So, what's important with respect to how this works with respect to indigeneity is, of course, how one tries to develop an ethics of working with indigenous knowledge system. The ethics of working with indigenous knowledge system may not always be dictate. It doesn't work with the ethics board that a lot of universities have in place. It may not necessarily work with that. It has to work with the sense of the community and what the community needs. And what the community may want may not always be what the researcher wants. And one needs to look into ways of understanding and, if not smoothing, the ruptures in the information cycle, but to acknowledge that there are ruptures and there have been moments of violent discrimination. So that is one of the things that one might be look at. Because look at this Linda Smith, who a lot of us know is about centering of research and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives. This is, of course, one of her phenomenal books, which came out, which was published in 1999. So 2019 was the year of 20 years of Linda Smith's book, where she brings out this brilliant poem on research methodology 101. We don't have the time to see that, but I would highly recommend people to actually look at that. What's also important is Linda Smith, along with other scholars in the Maori world, brought out a series of YouTube videos which work with Maori systems of belief and understanding, which also tells us that how one may be able to connect other indigenous conversations with respect to the Okanagan, right? And how that informs each perspective. Correct. This is, of course, certain images that I wanted to show from other communities. This, of course, as the picture says, it's what the Sapara territory against fossil fuels, defense of language, and women's right. What is interesting and exciting for me is that we are, if you look at it, the connection between land, language, and women power is extremely seamless. It is a seamless relationship, and the moment that one acknowledges that, I think one is able to take care of the ecosystem. This is, of course, the Rubber Valley, the Sacred Valleys, which is again a hotspot of biological diversity, and these are all part of our concerns with respect to indigenous communities. This is, of course, the phenomenon that we can see over here in a particular section of the Okanagan in the British Columbia. Very beautiful, as we saw in the first video. This is, of course, the Endocrine Center that I was speaking about. And I think the reason I remember tangentially mentioned about publications and politics, because this is important because for the longest time, a lot of mainstream publishers did not wish to publish indigenous writers. And so, or if they did, they would want it to be articulated in a way that was acceptable to mainstream readership, and mainstream reception. So this was an important intervention where one was allowed to think in the way one would like to think. I bring out a completely different context over here, and I think this is, of course, the reason is more personal than, and therefore I think political to be very obvious, is the Center for Karate Studies, which is something that was brought out in 2015, and which has also been doing very good work in with respect to Northeast area. This is an area that I work in, and I always find it very heartening to look at these two images together, because it gives us the understanding that finally you have indigenous communities being able to speak with themselves and to think of indigenous research methodology on their own terms, and I think that is a very crucial intervention. This is, of course, Jeannette Armstrong, who's seen as this grandmother and founder, and this is one of the ceremonies that you have in the Enlighten Center. This is in the Enlighten Center website. Okay, now coming back to this particular word that I'm talking about, and this is from Armstrong's recent essay in 2018, where she says that, and we look at it, is this word "timics," which refers to the ecology of the land, including all life forms. So the concept of timics emanates from the Cyrillic's language and is illuminated in the old story tradition. So the word allows access to the Cyrillic's concept of the human duty to nature. Examining the word allows us to perceive the depth of the Cyrillic's language, and it's a way to see existence in that timics as the life force of a place. So it also, and this is important because we also need to remember at this point that for the longest time, language was denied to much of Indigenous communities across Canada. We did not allow the residential school system, which was, I think, which actually this was as recent as 1996 that the last residential school system was closed down, that people were not allowed to speak their own languages. If you didn't speak their own language, you couldn't have access to the knowledge systems within that language. So the ability to reclaim language is also an ability to reclaim the land. Okay, and of course, as you can realize, the next point that you find in the slide is that seeing this image in the word is the particular way that this links has as an indigenous language carries nature images, generates meaning, and that the word can officially displays many strands. So the multi-layered element with respect to language is related to the multi-layered elements with respect to land. And this is something that comes across very dramatically in Whispering in Shadows, which was her second novel in 2000, where she speaks, where the protagonist is at odds with the wild, because the wild does not understand the language, does not understand that trees speak, and trees speak through the language that one inherits. Right. This was something that I spoke about in the earlier part, is of course the David Susan podcast about COVID-19 and the basic elements of life. And this was, I think, a very important intervention being made by Armstrong. As we speak today, we know that a lot of Indigenous communities have been engaged with a tussle between state forces and also development projects, quote unquote development projects, and how one tries to retain the land or retain connections with respect to land at that point. According to Cyrillic's ecologic knowledge, the response to the moral issue of human utility of other life forms is also the foundation of an egalitarian type of governance. The Cyrillic's practice. It is also extended outward in relations with other groups surrounding the territory. So Cyrillic's ecological knowledge can be seen in the judicious practices arising out of the system. The ecology of the territory is a living whole system. So what you have over here is this is social metrics, reviews that knowledge the system regeneration is grounded in an ethic for which the fundamental requirement is non-destructive land use. These are, of course, early books that we had mentioned. Slash was a very important intervention, and it's a moment that I can talk about women power here. Slash, the protagonist, was a man, but Armstrong insisted that this was a feminist text. In many quarters, it's seen as one of the first feminist novels by an Indigenous woman in Canada. And one of the reasons that it was seen because she spoke about what she terms as soft power, the healing power of women in the community, and also she speaks about the difficulties and misogyny within the community, and it is only a process of unlearning the misogyny that one can reclaim the land or can begin a process of returning. These are certain community spaces that I wanted to share, and I think this is very important because in fact, you also have one at UBC in the UBC campus in Kelowna, and I'm showing a video about this, about being able to think on one's own terms, and these community spaces have been created. This is of course the Elephant Center, but it has also been created in different parts of Canadian University, maybe Kelowna, where Armstrong works, is one of the areas where this has happened. What's also important over here is the ways in which the ecological land space and the idea of the Okanagan has entered mainstream academia. It was not there when Armstrong had started, but thanks to Armstrong and many others like her, such as Lina Armstrong, Joe and Epistino and others, that this has happened finally. And you have very young podcasts, and you have very young thinkers within the Indigenous community right now. It has led to a boom with respect to indigeneity that I think is very necessary. And because these are storytelling processes that are being done, because you see the storytelling process, the idea of cultural mapping is important because it helps us to undo other cultural mappings that have been imposed upon us into the cartography of reception with respect to Indigenous communities, which has of course perpetuated many stereotypes. This is of course, and these are two people that I wanted to talk about as well. Of course, this is Neil McGill in 2018. I'm very interested in somebody like Ryan McMahon because he is of course oeuvre and he is a brilliant stand-up comedian and also has these issues of podcasts which insist on these particular ways of Indigenous thinking. And of course, one of the major things that he came up with was how reconciliation could be seen as a joke within the context of Indigenous community, and it's something that they speak about extensively. Grand Chief of More Community Sadake, Mr. Serge Simon is important because we talk about the fishing debates that still plague Mohawk in the community, and there's this complex legal battle that is being still. It's a battle that is ongoing, and so it isn't a seamless journey for a lot of these communities, and I think that is something that we come back to over and over again. Finally, I think that's it. Yeah. Right. So this is one of the things that I wanted to talk about with respect to Jeannette Armstrong, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debashree, for a very interesting paper. We have two questions. One has been asked by Shomitra Roy. I mean, there are viewers who are watching this live on YouTube.
Right.
Very few people have been allowed to enter the meet directly.
Yeah.
So the question is, how far do you think is it possible to attain sustainability among Indigenous people, cutting across gender differences, disparities, and denials?
Okay, right. No, I think that's a very relevant question to ask. To be very frank, 10 years before, I wouldn't have been as optimistic. But given the situation right now with respect to Indigenous communities, given the situation with respect to the resilience practices that are happening within Indigenous communities, it is possible to think of sustainability. Right now, there is both the university space, and if you notice the talk given by Armstrong, the 4-minute clip that I showed of the larger talk, this was part of a group called Pioneers who've been doing extensive work with respect to sustainability and have engaged and have Indigenous people at the helm as well, along with other communities. So I think that is certainly possible. This is with respect to the North American context. But having said that, it's also a very difficult battle to fight because it is also a question of economics. It's a question of economics, it's a question of looking at ways of understanding the access, the right legalities that have been there in place, and to undo those legalities is a process that is still being fought. So it's a difficult battle, but it still hopeful because we wouldn't be speaking, and this whole discussion, interdisciplinary discussion on sustainability wouldn't be happening if we wouldn't, if it was not hopeful. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There is another question asked
Right.
by one of our first semester student who
Right.
just joined, and they're very enthusiastic about everything, you know.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's good to have.
I have a little problem with the framing of the question, but what I can understand of it is that how is indigenous knowledge, which kind of incorporates life spirituality, cultural history, language, etc., can be related to the concept of sustainability? That is a very basic question, of course, for us. That's what he wants to.
I think it's a very sensible way of looking at it, and I think it's a very nice question. What I would suggest is that one is that a lot of indigenous speakers, indigenous knowledge holders, which a lot of us over here would know, have been speaking on sustainability, and now they are also engaging with other forms of other bodies which that would make a difference for sustainability. And I think one of the best ways to begin with is to read people like Armstrong. And in fact, right now it's very convenient. You can just do a search on YouTube or even look at a podcast and you'll find all of these articles. In fact, and I will be happy to send that. The entire David Suzuki podcast is available online, and if one listens to that, I think one can understand the engagement with respect to sustainability and indigenous knowledge. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Let me ask my technical team, are there any more questions, Nick, right at this moment? Sorry, are there any more questions right at this moment?
I don't think so, ma'am. Let me just check once more for the live chat box.
Yes, just check
No,
it quickly, and then we will.
That's all, ma'am. That's all. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Debashree, once again. Thank you for being with us, and I hope we will be able to at least hear some portion of Amita's guest. So we move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Amita Sinha. She will be on myth history in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, USA, and has taught in the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning, IIT Kharagpur, in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department at IIT Gandhinagar. She is the author of Landscapes in India, Forms and Meanings, Cultural Landscapes of India Imagined, Enacted and Retained, which has been published by the University of Pittsburgh in 2020. She is also the co-editor of Cultural Landscapes of South Asia, Studies in Heritage Conservation and Management, and this is published by Routledge 2017. With this, I would invite Amita to deliver her presentation, her lecture.
Thank you very much, Chandra. It's really a pleasure to speak in the lecture series of the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media. I think Debashree Dattaray's talk on Indigenous knowledge systems really sets a very good stage for what I'm going to talk about today in the context of Braj in India. So let me just pull up my presentation.
Ma'am, can you just adjust your camera once because your full face is not showing?
Okay, just hold on for a minute. How's that?
No, we still can't see you fully.
Ma'am, if you're from from the laptop and you just want you open your lid further. Yeah,
That's better.
Right.
That's better. It's okay.
How's it now?
Yeah.
It's absolutely okay. Thank you.
Okay. Govardhan Hill in Braj is a very popular destination for pilgrims on the Ban Yatra. Its water bodies and forests are an example of placemaking in mythic and historic time. And I examine today one such water body and its surroundings known as Kusum Sarovar in the northern part of Govardhan Hill. I look at how placemaking occurred in the image of archetypal garden here. The site is of mythic and historic significance as a place of Radha and Krishna's love play and a memorial to the 18th century Jat ruler Surajmal. The place is found and reclaimed as a clearing in a grove with a pond and in the geometric pattern of garden pavilions on the edge of a built lake, reflecting both Hindu and Islamic garden imagery. So these two distinct design vocabularies are amalgamated in a hybrid style that is characteristic of Ganga Yamuna Sanskriti and is Braj's architectural heritage. And I'll conclude with outlining a sustainable conservation approach for this unique cultural landscape visited by pilgrims and tourists alike. Legendary associations with Lord Krishna have imbued the Braj region with great religious significance, drawing annually over 50 million pilgrims who go on circumambulatory tours of the landscape. And Braj is part of 3 states, Uttar Pradesh, Haryana and Rajasthan. It covers an area of 35 square miles. The river Yamuna flows on its eastern edge, and towards the west are the outlying spurs of the Aravalli Hill Range, among them the sacred Govardhan Hill. The lotus is a recurring motif in cultural imagery, with Braj often represented as a 12-petaled lotus, symbolic of the 12 ones. So Govardhan literally means increaser of cattle, and it was originally a site for cattle worship by the local tribes who feasted and circumambulated it with their cows during festivals. The sentient hill worshipped as a yaksha, who could assume any form, bull, peacock, serpent, is suggested by place names such as Mansi Ganga and Puchri. This primeval worship was co-opted in Puranic lore, and the Bhagavad Puran describes Govardhan as Haridasvarya, a devotee of Hari. So Krishna pointed out to his father and clansmen that the hill provided them with fresh water, fruits, and grass for the cows. He persuaded them that the hill should be worshipped, not God Indra, and so they paid obeisance by offering food and circumambulatory around it. Krishna assumed the form of Mount Govardhan, saying, "I am the mountain," and consumed the food offerings, an event that is celebrated in the festival of Annakut. So this painting shows him as a small figure sitting on top of the hill, as well as down below, one among the Gopas. So Krishna assumes 2 forms simultaneously. Govardhan or Giriraj, the king of hills, and Krishna become one and the same. So we see that Govardhan Hill is a site of hierophany, a manifestation of the divine, becoming in this narrative both Krishna and his devotee. So angry Indra sends incessant rains for a week, causing floods. Krishna then lifted Govardhan on his little finger to protect Brajvasis and their cattle. Indra accepts Krishna's supremacy and pays him obeisance. So Krishna Gopala lifting the hill becomes the defining event in establishing his prowess. The transcendent is made immanent, defining the site as sacred in this narrative of placemaking. But Govardhan abounds in many other place legends also as well. Besides the story of Krishna lifting the mountain, there are other stories associated with specific sites. Krishna and his brother Balram spend many hours grazing the cows on the tender grass of Govardhan Hill. The Vans and Kunds of Govardhan are setting for Krishna and Radha's encounters, their quarrels and reconciliations, and of Ras of Krishna and Radha and other gopis. In these narratives, natural archetypes, that is water, land and vegetation, are transmuted into the divine body of Krishna and Radha. And it's their materiality which becomes a medium or divine manifestation. So the hill is layered with rocky boulders as a result of being fractured both horizontally and vertically by tectonic forces. The purple quartzite stones are hard and dark in color. They are worshipped as embodied forms of Krishna as a Swarup and are adorned. So this evocation of Bhakti Bhav is facilitated by this anthropomorphic iconicity. So unlike its conical representations, actually Govardhan Hill is a long low ridge rising no more than 100 feet above the surrounding plains, and it receives the largest number of pilgrims in Braj. In circumambulating the 7-mile long ridge, pilgrims visit kunds and groves made sacred by place legends. And these places have continued to exist as a major repository of memories of Krishna's Leelas. They have been reclaimed time and again when loss of memory is threatened by sheer passage of time or instances of Islamic invasion. So the sacred sites are the link between mythic and historic time. Although the actual number of kunds in Govardhan Hill is far less than the imagined 108, it's large enough, it's around 23, for them to be an important presence in the landscape. Some are fed by natural springs, others are rain-fed and are replenished by surface flow. There are ponds with an irregular edge, and there are square or rectangular kunds and, with ghats and pavilions. A few kunds are built in pairs, with one catching the overflow of another. So these kunds in pairs actually are regarded as aqueous form of Radha and Krishna. Apsara and Naval Kund in the southern tip are perceived to be the liquid forms of Radha and Krishna, the intermingling waters symbolizing the essence of their love. The twin Radha Shyam Kunds situated in the midst of Radha Kund village is at the now vanished tip of Govardhan Hill are also believed to be the co-mingling aquatic forms of Radha and Krishna. And this is where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Bhajan Kutir is. So medieval texts describe the kunj as being surrounded by kunj with swings hanging from kadam, mango and bakul trees. The kunj is the archetypal garden represented by a grove of flowering trees. It's a popular subject of Pahari and Rajasthani paintings in which Krishna, Radha and the gopis are depicted in a natural grove on the banks of the river. Trees are symbols. Dark tamal of Krishna and the flowering kadam of Radha, who are portrayed standing under the tree, its tall trunk a vertical anchor in the picture plane for their figures. The clearing within the grove describes the round, a circle, which is a special archetype symbolic of wholeness. And this enclosed space is perfect for Radha and Krishna's love trysts and their waiting in anticipation of union. Trees with climbing, flowering vines, lotuses and birds symbolize harmony, renewal and plenitude. The grove is a natural garden in eternal springtime. And this represents a way of seeing nature which is resonant with human feelings of love and love and separation. The sympathetic correspondence between nature and human emotions implies that the ras is shared by the human or divine and the non-human world. The garden grove is the perfect setting for Shringar, Madhurya and Viraha rasas. The Mewar painting depicts the Nikunj as an arbor framing Radha and Krishna. Garlands are hanging from the flowering vines of the arbor. There is a crescent moon in the starry night sky. The Sakhi standing under the tree outside keeps watch as the couple makes love. So Krishna's circular dance with the gopis, that is the Ras Leela, on the full moon night of Sharad Purnima is much celebrated in literary and visual cultures of Braj. In these Pichwai and manuscript paintings, Ras Leela occurs in a clearing within the grove on the banks of the Yamuna and Vrindavan. The landscape is structured as an event in visual perception and is represented as such. The 19th century Pichwai shows Ras on one side with Krishna and Radha in the center, and Krishna is duplicating himself in a dance with each gopi. On the other side, with an empty center. And the gopis are holding a canopy symbolic of Govardhan on the ghats to the river. In the Mewar painting, Krishna is at the center at the circle playing the flute. The dancing gopis form the circle around him, while Radha and her Sakhi, who acts as a messenger, are shown in another grove. So the clearing in the grove is the Ras Mandal, the round as a spatio-temporal event in time. So this Kangra painting shows gopis searching for Krishna in the grove when he left for Mathura. They are asking the trees for his whereabouts. Nature is sentient in this episode. So Govardhan Hill likely was much lush than it is today. The surroundings are intensely farmed, but the hill itself has a few remnant groves of pipal, banyan, jamun and guava trees, plus there is a lot of hikar scrub. The State Forestries Department's efforts to plant are visible in labeling of trees and protective brick and wooden barriers around the saplings. The groves around the kunds that you see in this pilgrim map above, however, are much denuded. Then there are sthalis with Radha Krishna footprints, which are place markers grounding their narratives in specific locations. Ras Sthali specifically marks Krishna's dance with gopis and other and Radha. And there are a few Ras Sthalis in Govardhan. We usually associate, the Ras with Vrindavan, but Govardhan also has Ras Sthalis. The one marked in most pilgrim maps is in the proximity of Ratnakund, again in the north, amidst a grove. So the Ras Leela is enacted at these sthalis, especially in the monsoon season when the number of pilgrims during the parikrama is at its peak. So Kusum Sarovar in the northern part of Govardhan Hill is the major Padav Sthal for pilgrims. And it's an example of placemaking in two ways. In mythic time as the meeting place of Radha and Krishna and of their Ras Leela, and as the historic site of 18th century cenotaphs of the Jat ruler Surajmal and his two queens. So these memorials and their gardens are based upon Indo-Islamic precedent of mausoleums in Charbagh Gardens, but they depart from them in significant ways. They commemorate Surajmal as a devotee of Lord Krishna at the site of Krishna's eternal presence. Now Kusum Sarovar is protected by the Uttar Pradesh State Archaeology Department, but its historic importance is subsumed by its meaning, residing in the place that witnessed Krishna Leela. The place can afford visionary experiences in meditative contemplation to those devotees prepared for it. So the legend goes that this was a grove of flowering trees, pushed one, where Radha came to pick flowers. Krishna would climb a tree and playfully push the branch down while remaining hidden, so that unsuspecting Radha would be lifted up and caught in Krishna's arms. Nearby is Ashok One, where Radha's hair was braided by Krishna and he adorned her with jewelry. And to the southwest is Ratnakund and Rasthali. Now Uddhav, Krishna's friend and messenger, was the first pilgrim to Govardhan, arriving to give solace to the gopis who were distraught at the departure of Krishna to Mathura. So Uddhav became a creeper to witness the Leela of Krishna and gopis at Kusum Sarovar. To the west of Kusum Sarovar is the Uddhav Kund, which marks the appearance of Uddhav when Vrajnav, Krishna's great-grandson, organized the Ras. All of Krishna's friends and relatives appeared, and Uddhav too emerged from creepers to join in the celebration. So Uddhav Baitak or Uddhav Bihari temple is at the entry, and there is a small shrine to Shiva across the Kund. Sacred sites in Govardhan were reclaimed in the 16th century by charismatic saints such as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Vallabhacharya, Madhavendra Puri, and Narayan Bhatt. In fact, Narayan Bhatt in in 1545 rediscovered Kusum Sarovar and 3 other water bodies, Mansi Ganga, Chandra Sarovar, and Gobind Kund, among other sites. And he composed a text, Braj Bhakti Vilas, that mapped the Braj Mandal and laid out the itinerary for Ban Yatra, or the journey through the 12 forests. The saints are memorialized in samadhis containing ashes or some other relic, as well as in bhajan kutirs and baithaks. And these structures add historic layer. So at Kusum Sarovar we see Surajmal's cenotaph. Nahu Surajmal, well, he's the Jat Maharaja. He was a protector of Braj Mandal in his role as Braj Raj. The Jat kingdom actually extended over rather large territory, about 200 by 140 miles, with its capital at Bharatpur, and it included Mathura, Vrindavan, and Govardhan. Surajmal was an ambitious and powerful warlord, and he became enormously wealthy by plundering the Mughal capitals of Delhi and Agra. He and his father Badan Singh built fortified mud huts around their villages, and their fort at Bharatpur, the capital, was considered to be invincible. The Jats resisted Ahmad Shah Abdali's attack on Mathura and Vrindavan in 1757. They were patrons of many temples, then they built Havelis in Braj too. So on the banks of Mansi Ganga, in the center of Govardhan town, is the Mukut Mukhandan temple where Jat rulers worshipped. Surajmal had celebrated his victory over Mughal forces by lighting diyas, and his queen Rani Kishori had built a Haveli on its banks. Haveli is no longer there, but what you can see in the distance are the cenotaphs of the later Jat rulers. The pool at Kusum Sarovar was transformed into a kund in 1675 by Bir Singh Deo, the ruler of Orcha. And nearly a century later, Surajmal built a garden for his queen, Rani Kishori. Later, Surajmal's son, Jawahar Singh, built the cenotaphs of Surajmal and his two queens, Hansia and Kishori. This was somewhere between 1764 and 1768. Surajmal was actually killed in a battle in 1764 on the banks of River Hindal near Delhi, and his body was never recovered. But his mortal remains, 2 teeth, were cremated on the banks of the water body, which is typical of Hindu cremation rituals on river banks. And the Chhatris are memorials to him, Braj Raj and his 2 queens. The Chhatris were built of sandstone from Bansi Paharpur, Rajasthan, on a 460 feet long terrace above the kund. And this aerial view shows that Kusum Sarovar is really a unified composition in which architecture and the water bodies are integrated. The Chhatris, as garden pavilions on the high terrace, form punctuation points in a highly ordered geometric layout. The terrace is laid out in 3 squares, of which 2 are sunken charbags, access established by raised pathways in 2 directions, and reinforced by the 2 sets of 9 Chhatris. This tripartite division of terrace with a raised central square and 2 adjoining squares with sunken garden implies visual balance. A strong sense of unity is perceived in bilateral symmetry, reinforced by repetition of square and octagon and their interplay in forms. Domes of different sizes are repeated. The highest and the largest one is over Surajmal's Chhatri. The next in size and height are over Rani's Chhatris, and the smallest one are over Chhatris on the edge of the terrace. 4 smaller domes around the central dome are interspersed with cupolas resting over thin pillars on a square base. There are Bangladar arch chhachas on 4 sides in Surajmal's Chhatri and on 2 sides in the Rani's Chhatris. This is the Bangladar arch. The repetition of these domes and their cupolas at different scales makes for harmony in proportions. The 2 smaller Chhatris of Rani Hansia, Rani Kishori, and her Dasi are situated in charbags. They consist of 4 square sunken plots planted with grass and flowering shrubs. Now, unlike the Mughal Charbagh, there are no water channels or parterres. The chhatris are reminiscent of Mughal mausoleums, but they have no tombs really. The Charbagh garden does not symbolize Jannat or paradise, which the faithful will enter upon death. In the absence of Islamic connotation of tomb in Paradise Garden, the sunken gardens are ornamental settings for these memorials. Smaller chhatris with two kinds of roof, domical and bangladar, create a very picturesque effect, especially in their reflection in the Sarovar waters. As tall two-story structures, they function as overlook points to the Sarovar on one side here and to the landscape on the other. The main chhatri is 57 square feet in area. It's built on a white plinth. It consists of a room enclosed by jali screens with a circumambulatory passage around it. Shahjahani tapering columns, cusped in railed arches, and a continuous chhajja supported by brackets are signature elements of the Jat architectural style. The central dome, four corner domes, and bangladar vaults show the strong influence of Rajput Mughal hybrid architectural style. Kusum Sarovar is a 460 feet square. It's about 60 feet deep, and then these bushes again project 60 feet inside the kund. They are planted equidistant in two pairs on three sides. On the fourth side is a ramp for animals to go down to the water. Below the octagonal platforms on the bushes are the rooms enclosed with jalis, in which arched openings are inset. Surface ornamentation consists of cartouches and stars. Cusped arched openings supported by columns under the bridges allow water to flow through. Fresco paintings on the ceiling of Surajmal's Chhatri show episodes of Krishna Leela, including lifting of Govardhan, Annakoot festival, Ras Leela with Radha and other gopis, and Krishna Srinathji in a Haveli temple being venerated by Surajmal. There are paintings of Surajmal hunting and of his darbar at the Teak Palace. Krishna's footprints are carved in marble on the floor. And this place marker is a symbolic appropriation by Lord Krishna of this Chhatri. He is the eternal dweller at this site. And together with his iconographic representation in the ceiling frescoes, it establishes his everlasting presence here. So Jawahar Singh's Chhatri is to the south of Kusum Sarovar. This Ganga Bagh on the northern bank of Mansi Ganga, which was a cremation site of later Jat rulers. And these are really quite elaborate. The three-storied structures with the Samadhi on the ground floor, Chhatris of Raja Baldev Singh and his son Raja Balwant Singh, who ruled between 1823 to 1853, are on the banks of the Kund. And then there is another Chhatri nearby, Raja Randeep Singh's Chhatri, who ruled from 1805 to 1823. The Jat rulers Chhatris and Govardhan share the design vocabulary with the Deeg Palace complex, the summer capital of Jat kings. Deeg is about 14 kilometers from Govardhan, and it's actually on the Brajmandal Parikrama Marg. Inspired by Mughal garden palaces, it has open pavilions called bhavans, which are set in Charbagh gardens, and it has many Rajput architectural features: bangla roofs, chhatris and chhajjas supported by brackets. So Deeg epitomizes the Jat style in architecture, a composite of Hindu and Islamic elements. The three chhatris, which we saw in Kusum Sarovar, follow the Shahjahani Karina scheme, in which the central dominant structure is flanked by two symmetrical structures. So at Deeg Palace, we see Sawan and Bhadur pavilions projecting over Gopal Sagar, which can be traced to Khas Mahal at Agra Fort, where Bangla-e-Darshan and Bangla of Jahanara Begum flank the Aramgah. The Taj Mahal too is flanked by Masjid and its counterpart, the Mehman Khana. This tripart division reflects hierarchy as well. Surajmal's Chhatri is much larger than that of his queens. Kusum Sarovar is well used by the local community. The ghats and the bridges are populous interacting with water and engaging in devotional activities. It's also a Parav Sthal on the Govardhan Parikrama and is visited by large numbers of pilgrims and tourists. Well, given its importance, the entire hill should be a protected zone. Its natural landscape and its built structures, the historic temples, havelis, chhatris and kunds and shrines are significant material heritage, and they are settings of religious practices today. So restoration of bunds and kunds is essential for preserving place-based legends. Kusum Sarovar and its surroundings are proposed as a major Parav Sthal. This is the Parikrama Marg in the reforested bush and ashok vans. The dense Kikar jungle on the west is cleared for a camping site, which is linked with trails to Uddhav Kund here, and to the complex of sites on the southwest that include Ratnakund, Rasthali, and Jawhar Singh's Chhatri. The grove around Uddhav Kund is replaced largely with farm fields, so planting a buffer zone of trees and flowering shrubs can protect the Kund from further encroachment. A circumambulatory pathway around the Kund can be linked to the trails leading to Kusum Sarovar. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that Kusum Sarovar is an excellent example of syncretism in landscape and architectural design vocabularies. Islamic forms, domes, cusped arches, tapering columns were mixed with Rajput forms, bangladar roofs, chhatris, chajjas, frescoes on ceiling, creating composite forms typical of Jat architectural style. The Charbagh gardens in the elevated terrace are juxtaposed with ghats with their burjas in a kund. The flowering kunj with a pool was transformed into an architectonic landscape of memorials in these four square gardens. Kusum Sarovar reveals placemaking in the image of archetypal garden grove, the kunj, that sustained collective memory of Krishna and Radha's Leela for millennia. Another layer was added with memorial chhatris at their gardens, shaped in the image of the cross within a square, the four square pattern. The landscape was framed as a view from the elevated terrace and its chhatris, in contrast to the hidden and enclosed forest clearing with the pool. Yet place legends remain active in the collective memory, and Surajmal's memorial commemorates him in service of Lord Krishna, whose footprints and imagery pervade the built environment. Thus, placemaking plays a central role in this continuum of myth into history. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Amitadev. It has been wonderful. And I was so fascinated by the pictures. Now, I have a question which might sound very naive to you. Pardon my ignorance about its landscapes and architectural forms. But my question is that kind of syncretism that we see with Surajmal's cenotaph, which you said that it resembles Muslim. I mean, is it only characteristic or specific to Jat architecture, or we do find this kind of hybrid forms throughout Rajasthan? I mean, in different kinds of Rajasthani architectural form.
Right. So yes, these are actually a Rajput invention, so to speak, because with cremation nothing is left behind, right? And so there is really no tradition of building memorial. The spirit can achieve moksha or it can be reincarnated. Of course, in ancient India, there was a tradition of memorial making with relics, as we saw in the stupas, Buddha and Bodhisattvas. But I think the Rajputs were inspired by the Mughal mausoleums, especially the grand mausoleums of Mughals, starting with Humayun and Jahangir, Shah Jahan, so on. And so they started building these chhatris. Chhatris literally mean umbrellas, and so we have chhatris built by the Amer rulers, by the Jodhpur rulers, and they are simply, the Samadhi platform. And so today also in Rajghat, for instance, in Delhi, which is really a vast necropolis, it's really just a Samadhi platform. But with the Jat kings, their chhatris became very elaborate, and they with these domes, big domes and small domes, and their cupolas. I think they were very much influenced by Shahjahani architectural style. So form was imitated, but the meaning is not there, right? I mean, there is no mausoleum, there's no grave, there's no concept of, being buried, and if you receive Jannat, you'll be in paradise with flowering trees and dancing, huris. Instead, it's simply, a memorial structure commemorating the reign of the Rajput. But here in Govardhan, we see this site specifically chosen by Surajmal to build a garden, and then it becomes, his memorial. And as I pointed out, a lot more people come here to worship Lord Krishna than to admire, the Chhatri.
The Chhatris they are covers, on of the burial place or something like that. I mean, they're just resting places, because there are series of Chhatris that you have shown, 9 Chhatris, they've been symmetrically arranged. So what was the function? Are they simply, decorative, meant for embellishment, or they had some kind of even if symbolic, some sort of symbolic meaning?
So these are cremation sites. The body of Surajmal, he died. The body was cut into pieces. They could never find his body. And so what his family, his son did was they found 2 teeth, and they cremated. That's like the cremation site. The Chhatri is a cremation site. Just as it's a Samadhi platform basically, but in this case with a domical cover. And these are actually, there are 3 Chhatris here. The central one of Surajmal and his 2 queens, and the other 9, those 9 Chhatris are simply outlook points. There are other Chhatris of Jat rulers in Mansi Ganga, which is a little further down south.
Even the garden is it is an imitation of the Muslim garden, isn't it? That charbagh structure. Clearly, it's yes. I have another comment which has been made by an erstwhile research scholar of our university, of our department. She has commented that the Indian mythological tradition, it is the Ashokvan which has been the eternal metaphor of Radha Krishna's amorous, all kinds of amorous days. I'm not really sure about this, because is Ashokvan related to Radha Krishna, or is it related to Ram Sita? And it is the place where Ravan kept her in captivation, isn't it, Sita? Ashokvan, is it associated with the Radha Krishna legend?
Yeah. Ashokvan, I think again is a generic term. Yeah, there is an Ashokvan, in Lanka, and that's where Sita was kept captive. Right?
But how far is it associated with the Radha Krishna myth?
So I think let's look at the view of nature in Hinduism, and what is the meaning of one. And the one is a place of exile, as we see in Ram, Sita, and Lakshman's narrative. But the one is also a place of eros, and in the case of Krishna and Radha Leela, it is a place for their trysts. So it is not wilderness. It is what should I say? Nature. There are many connotations of nature, and wilderness is a place of of demons, and and maybe the term aranya better captures, that chaos that wilderness represents. But the one is something different. The one is it can be a tapovan, a place of penance. That's why Tagore names his ashram as a tapovan in Shantiniketan. But it can also be a place of of lovemaking. So the courtly tradition. We look at the courtly traditions of Gupta era. Yes, of the great plays of Kalidas.
Yeah.
Nature is is a protagonist. The cloud is a protagonist. Carries is a messenger, and so here also in Govardhan and in Vrindavan, the forest becomes the site uh, for for these encounters, amorous encounters between Krishna and the gopis.
So it is not the Ashok one, but it is a one or a Kunja one, which is a kind of a generic term, right? Having different kinds of connotations, changing connotations, right? Is that what you're suggesting?
Any one, is named actually after the trees. So Ashok trees, Pushpavan here in this case, and full of flowering trees.
Okay. Thank you, Amit. I think it was wonderful. And I would, if anybody has any question, one can come up. We have about 10, 11 people in the meet. So if anyone has a question, we have time to take at least questions, 1 or 2 questions.
Ma'am, your video is off, ma'am.
My video is off. My video?
Yes.
I have deliberately kept it off.
Oh.
So I was just wondering if anyone has a question here from those who are there directly in this meet.
I was wondering if anyone has visited Braj and Govardhan has actually.
I have visited Braj, but I was very young at the point of time, and I didn't have the eye to see, the way things. I try to see things nowadays. So it was just a visit when I was kind of running around in the places. That's it.
Well, Vrindavan today, is full of temples, and the Yamuna, the banks are not. They don't really have kunj, and Govardhan too, you see more rock than trees. So it's hard to relate it to what we see in the paintings. And so we now think this is the imagined landscape. It's a mythic landscape, which implies that myth never really had a historical basis. It's like all make believe, all imagined. But I think we can take this in a different way. Imagined as a very strong imagery that resided in the collective unconscious for a very, very long time. And that's why I say there is a continuum between myth and history. I don't think we really need to establish Krishna as a historic figure. But what we can say for sure is that these places are a testimony to events that happened a long, long time ago, and they're slipped into mythology. And my main argument is that the place becomes a custodian of memories, and then the collective memory rests on imagery. So.
Hi, yes, Debashree. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, if it's okay. Just a really quick question for Amit, if I may. I think it was something at least to the eyes, especially in a situation where we are all trapped without being able to travel. So I think that would be really nice. I probably have a very simple question, and I think it probably has a very long answer, but I would just make a short one of it. Is that what is it that drew you to work on this particular area? What is it that drew you to talk about imagined landscapes within, the feeling of architecture, where it and how does it come from there? How does it feed into your interest as with architecture is what I was wondering. Because, and also I was wondering if you if you connect this to Romila Thapur's understanding of historical consciousness. Yes, so this is two questions. Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. It was really nice to see you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
So I, was teaching landscape architecture department at University of Illinois, and I was actually I had a PhD in architecture, and my field was housing, low-income housing. And when I joined the landscape architecture department, I felt that I could contribute to landscape studies,
Right.
and there was really not much,
Right.
by way of landscape studies, the discourse of landscape studies when it came to South Asia. So I started actually thinking about going beyond the Mughal gardens and looking at the period before, prior to Mughals. And we were doing a project in Sarnath way back in 1990, and I kept hearing from my colleagues say, "Oh, India doesn't really have a garden tradition. Did not have a garden tradition before the arrival of Muslims, especially the Mughals." And I thought this cannot be true because Indic cultures are very close to nature, and harmony with nature is, always promoted. Right down, to 20th century, to Tagore's writings and poetry. So I visited Braj, and I thought, okay, let me try to figure out, what's going on here. And the literature on Braj was, mostly dominated by pilgrimage scholars writing about pilgrimage. And there's a lot of, there was a lot of work, done on Braj already, but there's still actually, I think, some kind of lack of really comprehension because Charlotte Walters talked about Buddha, as as a as a bull, and and she says there were local traditions, and there's some cooperating Krishna tradition, and Krishna of Vrindavan is not the same Krishna of Dwarka and Mathura, and really it's all made up. There's no historical basis. But if you really you look at archaeological studies, the tradition of Krishna in Mathura goes back a long, long time ago. Even though even though Buddhism dominated, and we find a lot of Buddhist statues. So I think landscape studies in South Asia should pay more heed to indigenous, like in North America, indigenous concepts of nature, the arts of garden making, thinking about natural environment as a kind of garden before the architectonic or the geometrical forms became dominant.
Thank you.
It's a long answer, sorry.
No, I got it. No, it wasn't a question that could have a short answer. Thank you very much. That is helpful.
I think it's time now to request my colleague Dr. Sneha Kottothuri to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to Sneha.
Okay, first I would like to begin by thanking both the speakers, Professor Amita Sinha and Dr. Debashree, for their extremely perceptive and insightful lectures. It was a delight listening to both of them. And I would especially also thank the senior members of our advisory committee and executive committee who has been helping us in running the center from time to time. And I would again thank especially Professor Chandra for organizing this lecture series, and Professor Shipra Mukherjee from the department for attending the event. And special thanks goes to the entire technical team, which comprises of our current and erstwhile students. I must mention them: Orithro Banerjee, Shilajit Vishwas, Sudipto Dotto, and Audrey Jadavpur running all the technical things, and the posters have been done by Akash Mukherjee. So thank goes to the audience also for attending this this webinar, and I hope we will be soon back with more lectures in this series. Thank you.
We have one more new inclusion into this technical team, who is Diti. Diti is a new inclusion. Yes, Diti Chatterjee. Thank you very much, everybody, those who have joined from other departments and from undergraduate colleges. And I'm sure we have a large number of, audience so far as the YouTube live streaming was going on, and many have joined there. So thank you, everybody. Let us